My name is Jeff Johnston. My wife, Pam, Johnston, and I modeled the Sugar Pine Lumber Company and Minarets and Western Railway circa September 1927 in HO scale. We have a double deck layout built into a fairly compact room. And also by way of introduction, I've been authoring model railroad articles since the early 90s. And some of you may remember this book, which is the NBC Shea Handbook. That was mine from a while back. And you may recall me from a variety of model railroader articles and such. The center circular part of this logo is from a piece of correspondence that I have from the railroad back in the day. And this is layout construction, general observation ideas after some time in the trenches. Most of us that are building layouts at one point or another have this sort of mess in the layout room with bench work, track work, everything else going on seemingly all at once. Believe it or not, it is there is an end in sight. And first of all, Burr, you can see my cursor on screen. Okay, this, if nothing else, this gives you kind of an idea about the system we use for supporting the second deck. These are L-shaped, or these are plywood gussets, 1/4-inch plywood, doesn't have to be real huge, screwed to the wall, basically on every stud. And we did a stress test with one of these gussets that's available on one of my videos on one of my YouTube videos about building double deck layouts. And with this device mounted on a test stand and weight out at the end, we got 75 pounds of weight on the end of a single piece of wood here without the piece failing. I was going to load it down until it failed and then weigh it. We got up to 75 pounds. And since I don't model G scale and I don't have G scale big boys running around the layout in brass, that's obviously more than enough strength to support what we're going to be doing in HO scale. This is the track plan that was published by Kalmbach in the book How to Build Model Railroads in Less Space. This, I think, was 2014, I believe, was when this one came out. And it has a very nice summation article about the layout. This is in approximately a 10 by 30 foot room, or a little bit smaller, measuring the inside walls. 24 feet approximately is dedicated to the layout. The end 6 feet is our workbench area, with Pam's workbench next to mine. And it is truly delightful to be able to have my wife there working on something with me in the layout room. That's a delightful part of this whole process. Essentially, we're modeling the Sugar Pine Lumber Company, but it connected to the outside world, so to speak, in Fresno. So to the Southern Pacific. So the mainline part of the layout is Southern Pacific oriented. The rest of it is Sugar Pine. On the upper deck, we have this type of staging yard at the north end and the south end. The north end staging yard obviously represents destinations north of the layout, north of Fresno, anything in the Pacific Northwest or elsewhere. And the south end staging represents the south end of the world. The staging yards have broad enough radius that they will be able to accommodate the largest locomotive we have, which at the time is a cab forward that I inherited. It wasn't really planned for the layout, but I inherited from a friend who passed away. And there's a turntable on the end here to be able to turn the locomotive, and so I don't have to fiddle that every time. And you'll see more about that on the video for those of you who stick around to watch the video. So we have Central Camp here, which is built, which is a two-piece unit that used to be a freestanding part of the layout. Now it's part of the double deck, and I got a photo to kind of illustrate that later. Approximately 24-inch minimum aisle points here, with a wider passing zone, so to speak, here that allows Your average robust size modeler to pass comfortably for operation. And then of course, the central area is 4 feet wide by however many feet long, plenty of room there. During one of the narrow gauge conventions, we had, I think, 14 people in the room looking things over successfully. That was sort of a pretty significant proof of concept. This is where the helix is, and the helix takes up a lot of space, but in our case, the top of the helix is also where the logging camps are. So it's making as good a use of the space as we can. The colors on this chart that I keep around indicate the areas where we have 6 different power districts for the layout, with 6 of the circuit breakers, the Tony's circuit breakers. This way we kind of won't forget. So if the light goes on indicating it's short, we know where it is and maybe who's responsible. A little more accurate drawing of the logging area. It comes up from central camp up a 3% grade across a lift up access bridge on the main aisle. But that's okay, because that bridge is only used when you're approaching or leaving the logging area with the train. The rest of the time it tilts up and you use the staging yard here and working the logging camps. Seems to work so far. We have a number of these little black plastic tool or part tote trays that we use, and each one is dedicated to a particular type of part of layout construction. In this case, this one is for wiring, for example. Another one is dedicated to track work. Works very handy for us, so you have all your correct tools in place when you need them. And this is a platform, my mobile work platform, so to speak, built on an audio-visual table that would be used like we used to use in high school to hold a 16mm projector. You can get those on eBay and used places like Goodwill and so on. And we can move that to right where I'm working, so everything is right handy. I kind of like that. Like everybody else, we have all kinds of different radius of templates we use, as well as trommels. Everything from the mainline minimum 30-inch down to 21 and smaller for the industrial or logging areas. And the smaller radius curves, the longest cars that we use on the logging areas are 40 foot, and the longest mainline cars are 50-foot box cars. So the 30-inch radius seems to work pretty well for that. Putting one of the patterns here in use, held down with some little weights, fishing weights, and some large machine bolts that I have filled up with lead shot and resin. And this lets you, of course, draw the center of the track work on the homosote. And not to start another homosote war, good, bad, or otherwise, but I've used homosote glued with white glue directly to 1/2-inch plywood on layouts in Indiana and Southern California and Oregon, and all kinds of different environmental conditions and humidity conditions. And I've never had a problem with buckling or warping or any of those things. It's always worked great for us. This is the corner of the layout heading in from Central Camp into the town of Berrien Vista, which is Pam's town. I highly encourage people to own a 4-foot level, partly because the 4-foot is close enough to half of 100 inches that you can put a 1/2 inch block under one end, for example, if you're trying to set a 1% grade, and that gives you a consistent grade leveling throughout, plus just general leveling. And in this corner of the layout, this is a bridge position, and I wanted the ground to be somewhat lower there, so we cut away part of the framework that supports the upper deck framework in order to drop the scenery down a little bit. And because we're cutting that away and trimming down on the size of the benchwork, we have some 3/4 inch plywood braces that are glued to the inside and reinforced, which works out really well. Hasn't had anything fail yet, but then I haven't had any 400-pound friends come over and put their elbow on it yet either. And up here, you can see this plywood. This is 8 or 9 layer half-inch plywood that a friend who worked at a plywood mill here in Eugene had been able to purchase as seconds because they were somewhat damaged. So I got a half a dozen sheets of this half-inch, what they called apple ply, I think, plywood for $5 a sheet. This was a few years ago, and unfortunately, he no longer works there, but the layout is mostly framed up, so that's fine. And this is kind of what that corner is looking like now. Because the layout is positioned in the Sierra Mountains, as well as the valley down by Fresno, up in the Sierra, there's a lot of locations where you don't have a lot of dirt, but you have a lot of exposed granite. So these paler areas are essentially going to be the granite, where there's just really a few little bushes, but not much else other than granite rocks and some weathering. So that's somewhat in process here. And this again is what will be a trestle location. Another very useful tool is a little bullet level. And like I said, there are people who don't have these, but for just leveling everything, they're extremely convenient. And you can see from my riser, this is 1/4 inch plywood. This is a little 3/4 inch cleat. I have seen people use 2x4s for this sort of thing, which seems to me a little bit of overkill, but everybody does it a different way. This 1/4 inch plywood and this size of components, it hangs together just fine and has not had any problems with warping or shifting or anything along those lines. But I have something of a carpentry background from years ago, so I know how to make this sort of stuff work. This is the part of the layout central camp that started out as originally a freestanding 2-piece kind of a modular design, and it was adapted in the final layout as a second deck, cantilevered with support in the middle. And it was really interesting rebuilding the framework and such underneath this while that part of the layout had track and homosote and everything else on it already, and all these tortoises. It worked out okay. So far, it's no failures or anything. And another lesson that I learned from club layouts in the past is always provide a way to be able to get to any part of the layout for maintenance, even if you got to kind of sneak in up there and figure out how to get in behind everything to reach everything. The rest of the layout, it's all within an arm's reach. I emphasize that for my own convenience and for being able to reach everything and work on everything comfortably. One of the more challenging parts of adapting the central camp layout to where it is now is the fact that it was built in Indiana, and then it spent time in 2 different houses since then in 2 different climate areas, and then here in Oregon. So putting the 2 parts of the layout together along the gap, and then having everything in the moves and such kind of shifting around a little bit. So it took some shimming and adjustments in order to get all the joints accurate across the gaps here, but it worked. Each of our planned bridge locations looks something like this. We have the benchwork for both sides of the track that'll be staying there. The middle eventually gets removed, of course, for the bridge to go in. And by putting these parallel or identical size blocks in here with this brace across the bottom, when we cut this middle piece out, if it was only one piece, there is a chance that the subroad bed on both ends could possibly warp up or down, and you wind up without a smooth, straight transition to the bridge and then continuing. So these pieces on the ends hold everything in alignment after the bridge component is cut out. Most of the layout is code 70 track. These little spurs and sidings and such are code 55 generally. This is coming off of central camp. switch block where the main line, the SP, so to speak, main line to the top staging yard leaves by the lower track, and the 3% grade up to the logging area leaves by the diverging track. That means there's going to be two vertical curves very close to the switch. So by running the sub-road bed through my table saw and putting some little notches here, it makes it much easier for this to form a gradual curve rather than forcing it somehow. And that works both up, down, whatever, but seems to work pretty well and has not weakened things considerably through here. Because I use code 70 on the main line and the switches and so on, and then the code 55 is primarily for sidings and such, and spurs. So I have code 55 to 70 adapters. I've got a video on how to engineer these particular rail size transition joints. And I always, because I'm kind of picky, I always shim everything to make sure that everything is smooth, because one drawback to Homosote is they're not always consistent thickness sheet to sheet. It'll vary by a certain percentage of an inch, although I'm not really sure how much. But by shimming everything and getting it all straight initially, that makes for much smoother joints and much more consistent operation. And these are the drop-down feeders, of course, for the DCC system, which is lengths, just soldered into the rail. And once these are painted to match the ties and so on, and the rail and so on, they are not visible enough to be a problem for us anyway. The microengineering code 55 track is, it's engineered to look like mainline rail. So I tend to cut out a bunch of the ties. I haven't taken out all of them here yet, but we cut out a bunch of ties in order to space them out a little bit and make it look more like a temporary logging type siding. And if I've already got part of the track laid and I want to take a few more ties out, I take one of these flat blade or parallel blade box knives, so to speak, lay it on the layout with the blade up, put the track on the blade, and then very carefully push down on the track, which cuts the little plastic joiners between the ties. And then I can just cut the tie and break each one out so I can scatter them out a little bit more. This could be one of those things that's kind of difficult to recommend to everybody, because it could be a dangerous operation if you're not careful, but if you're careful with it, it works great. This is an example. This lower one is standard microengineering rail, and these two have both had ties removed and ties spaced out a little bit to better represent the occasional haphazard track laying that logging companies would do. I made a full-size template for the top of the helix and the logging spur on the side that's roughly my shoulder height against the side of the entry walkway in the layout. This is kind of inspired by Dave Clune's layout, where he has some very narrow benchwork along one side of the room, getting from point A to point B. This allows precise design of the curved switches, the rails or the spurs and so on for the logging area. And I use these little photocopies or printouts of 40-foot log cars in order to estimate accurately how many and realistically how many cars will fit on a given siding. So those have been used all over the layout, and they're a big help. We also use photocopies of switches and the actual switches taped on there to help design the whole thing. The idea here is there will be a mountain ridge of sorts down the middle of the helix. So if you're operating on this side, you don't see across the mountain to the other side. So that helps to create a little bit of visual or implied distance, I suppose. A little more close up, working on developing the ladder track here. This the right leg of the Y goes to the drop-down bridge to the rest of the layout. And this is a kind of a closer view of what these photocopied cars look like. They're a wonderful planning aid. And when putting the cars on here at the tail end of the log spur, by adding this little extension on here, I'm doing what model railroaders do, which is take just a little more space out. And by adding that on, I was able to get one more car realistically into my staging yard track. And that wound up with a little chunk of the track sticking out into the doorway. But again, this is about, I'm 6'6", and this is out in the, well, it's up roughly my shoulder height. So we've got padding around the corner, and not all modelers who come in here are my height, so it's not really a problem for most people anyway. We frequently modify switches by taking sections of track out here and there in order to make things fit together a little bit tighter. It's not that hard to do with ready to go or ready to lay switches and so on. After establishing the entire pattern and shape and design for the layout top, we started by cutting out different chunks of the cardboard to more or less represent individual pieces of the sub road bed. And then those were laid down on our chunks of plywood, trying to, plan around as efficient a use as we can. Mark it, cut it out, works great. Couple of tools that are really worth mentioning. These little DeWalt, I don't know what they call it. It's a short, it's an angled head drill, but for getting in some of those tight spots in the layout, this is fantastic. It's a tool that I use all the time. This one dates back to the late 80s, early 90s, and I hope it keeps lasting, keeps working. And these corner, 90-degree corner clamps for building framing and benchwork and so on, very, very useful. But then I like to have 90 degrees be 90 degrees and so on. More good uses for the 4-foot level. We were establishing where the second deck was going to go up above the for the log staging yard. So we had a couple of blocks screwed on the wall based on leveling from the rest of the layout. Clamp those guys on, and you have this wonderful baseline, so to speak, for the rest of the area up there. These one-hand clamps also are something that are pretty basic, but they're extremely useful, and I cannot imagine doing my bench work or really any kind of carpentry work without them anymore. This is the staging yard and entry for the logging area before it's mounted on the wall. The chunk of polystyrene in here, this still has to have its homosode added, so it'll be a smooth surface across the styrene. And this is just, it'll be scenic, but it's not really an impressive scenery area. So we'll eventually cut this out and create a little bit of a creek through here with 3 tracks and 3 short single bent bridges across there, just to add some interest and maybe be another interesting photography spot, because I'm always thinking about photography and video work while I'm doing these things. Mounted on the wall with the homosode fastened down. A lot of white glue on the homosode, and then I use 3/4 inch or 1 inch brad nails, 18 gauge nails to hold the homosode down. And I've got it clamped here, the clamps were to hold it in place while I was nailing it. And the nails pretty much just hold it down until the glue dries. And the heads are embedded far enough below the surface of the homosode that they don't represent a problem when working on the top of the homosode, track laying or anything else. There's nothing to run into. They're pretty well embedded. This is the top lift bridge hinged on this end, and now they have some keyways at this end to be able to line it up. And you move from the staging yard area up here, across this bridge and down the grade to the yard at Central Camp, where they you marshal the log cars and send them down the line. This was kind of a tricky piece because it's a curve, and it also has a vertical curve in the middle because it comes up here straight, flat from the main line, and then it curves over to match this flat surface at a higher level. So we took a little bit of time designing this thing and planning out this curve cut and so on, but it seems to work fine for the kind of trains we're going to be running up there. And this lifts up, is out of the way for most of the time when people are coming and going for operating here in the aisle. And when they need to, you drop this down and you pass through coming down to Central Camp or bringing empties back up, and then you lift this back up and you stand right here to operate this area. That's the plan anyway. I'm getting less flexible as I get older, so jamming my head down on the layout to eyeball the track, benchwork, or whatever becomes a little bit of a chore. And I keep a mirror handy, so when I want to take a look at something and verify how it's lining up, just set the mirror down on the layout, look at that, and that pretty much gives you all the information you need to know. Works great, saves my neck. Kind of a low angle view of how this staging yard is positioned on the aisle going in. Again, this is about shoulder height for me, and most people just simply walk by underneath. And yes, we will have a variety of step stools and such for people, normal sized people who want to get up there and operate. And the intense blue of the walls, that kind of dates back to the fact that my railroad photography started back in the film days, and Kodak Ektachrome 64 tungsten was a type of film that when you photograph something blue like this, almost invariably, it recorded that blue as a much lighter, more washed out shade than it actually was. So I painted this, we painted the wall extra dark. Digital photography, of course, doesn't do that. It just records what you're seeing there. So it's a little bit dark, but really don't mind, because I'd rather start dark, and then I can always lighten it up with haze and so on, and hazy air, hazy clouds or whatnot, as we work on the backdrop paintings. Kind of an overview of how that area looks, or looked at the time. The drop-down bridge goes from the logging branch here up to the layout. And then it curves around the side here to what is now the end log camp in this area. And you can kind of see that this does not represent a huge impediment to people walking in and out of the layout. This is one of the log landings where I showed you the picture of modifying the code 55 track, just temporarily have some maintenance away equipment stored there while we work elsewhere on the layout. And everything here, this system works. People have said, gee, you use that 1/4-inch plywood on those risers. Is that strong enough? Well, of course it is. It's not flexing a lot. It's not carrying a lot of weight. It's all we need anyway for this sort of construction. And we have little signs that we put up around the layout during one of our layout tours, answering the basic questions that people have frequently about what they're looking at. And that saves a lot of time to answer questions during the tour when I want to be someplace else. Lighting the lower deck can often be a bit of a challenge. We purchased some LED strip lights that were, because of my photography interest, I wanted all the lights to be consistent. So the main room lights are LED daylight bulbs, 5500K, the same with the strip lights. So I can photograph the top or the bottom, and it's going to look pretty much the same, we hope. But this is the lower area, the lower deck with the Pinedale lumber mill area, 3 long buildings along this wall that are the box shook factory and planing mills and so on. The engine house at Pinedale, the Minarets and Western Engine House that they built. I found a blueprint for that guy, so I was able to make that about as accurate as I could, reading what was a kind of a hinky blueprint. And we're not much one, although Pam will have a second opinion on lighting for structures, but we put some of the small LED lights underneath this structure, which at least throws a little bit of light on the deck here so you can see what's going on under there. Overall view of the room looking to one end, central camp on the left here with a little bump out that of course we needed. And this is Berrien Vista, Pam's town on the right. Again, with a little bit of a bump out for the passenger and freight stations. Building flats, kit bashed structures that help to conceal the upper deck support brackets behind them. And we have since added considerably more lights, because maybe my eyes are getting old, but I like a lot of light for when I'm working on things. Down here on the lower deck, this is the Pinedale Mill area, the engine house, sinker derrick, and the log dump here, which is at Pinedale. And this will wind up being Friant, which is the end of an SP branch out of Fresno for many years. And then it became the means by which the minarets and Western sugar pine lumber continued through up through the hills up to the cutting areas. And the heights on these were designed so that it was comfortable for Pam with her being able to see it, but not so low that I couldn't see the lower deck either. And mechanically, operation-wise, it seems to have worked out pretty well. These little track lights with the daylight bulbs are extremely, well, they're versatile and functional, and they provide a nice soft light throughout. That is pretty much the end of that part of the layout presentation. I'd like to find out if anybody has any questions on that.
I'd like to point out that Jeff is a promoter and planner and manager of the annual Logging Modelers Congress in Elsie, Oregon every year. It's not a 4D exercise, so you may not see it in the NMRA publications, but it's an independent model railroad show, and just one of the great venues available to modelers every year. Just a visit to Elsie, Oregon, and that magnificent Lodge and Cafe and Railroad Museum halfway between Portland and Seaside is a experience in itself. But it's one of the great modeling meetings every year. Jeff, is the COVID passed so that we can have it again this coming year?
Well, it won't. The date is April 2nd next year, so I'm sure hoping it is.
Great.
We're staying in touch with Camp 18 to make sure they're having events down there and so on, and we're sure hoping it's going to work. And by the way, anyone who comes by to visit the layout, we have these lovely Sugar Pine Lumber Company ceramic mugs as a layout visit parting gift. You can't buy these, but you can get them by visiting the layout. So something to keep in mind.
What was that date? April what?
April 2nd.
April 2nd. First
Saturday in April next year.
Jeff, I always think of you as an Oregon guy. Did you grow up in Northern California or Central California? No,
I'm Oregon City right now, right outside of Portland.
You just like sugar pine.
Yeah, it happened.
Hey, Jeff, could you just talk a little bit about glue? Did you only use Elmer's glue on that whole layout, or do you use carpenter's glue, or do you rely on screws?
Well, we use we do use screws all the time, and most of it is Elmer's regular, what they called white generic glue. Lately, we've been using the yellow or brown, so to speak, carpenter's glues because they're supposed to be stronger, but I've never had anything that I built with white Elmer's glue fall apart. So, and it's white glue, of course, on the underside of the homosote because that's frankly the cheapest and the highest volume use. And we use typical wall, the black anodized wallboard type screws throughout. As needed, but it's a combination of the two. And by putting the two in there, things just don't come apart. Well, like I say, I've got a 3-part series on building the second deck for the layout on YouTube, and I think part 2 is the one that has the test for the second deck support bracket. That's pretty interesting. I put a 5-gallon bucket on the end, dump it full of gravel, and it doesn't fail. And I start adding. I had some trailer hitch balls and metal weights and whatnot that I piled on there, and we got up to about 75 pounds without fail. So I figured that was a good proof of concept.
I appreciate your point that modelers frequently underestimate the strength of materials. I'm going to use a spline roadbed with homosote atop the splines with no supporting plywood between the homosote and the splines. And everybody who looks at that, tears their hair out and says, oh, it's going to be a disaster. Well, I have laid a sheet of 1/2-inch homosote across joists, 10-inch on center, and I've knelt on it with no deflection. I wouldn't jump up and down on it, but I can kneel on it with no deflection. So a 1/2-inch homosote on splines, it's a waste of material to put another sheet of plywood underneath it.
Oh yeah, well,
no problem.
Building things with wood is like building an aircraft. You don't need to throw volume at it to make it work. If you use the right components and arrange them in the right way, it can be relatively lightweight. Yeah, this is only 7 minutes long. Again, this is the track plan, courtesy of Kalmbach. Basic walk-in to kind of give you a sense for where things are and how the room is laid out. The storage underneath, by the way, was designed, the height and the width of the storage area was designed for ream boxes of paper. So they all fit there and it works pretty well. I should point out that many of the structures that you see up here in Berrien Vista were built by Pam. She is very courageous. She has no fear of diving into a Craftsman kit and putting something together. I really like that. All right, a little hard to see here, but the DCC components are mounted on the wall here in the middle of the layout underneath the lower deck. Putting them in the middle means that there is no one long run of the power supply to one end of the layout or the other. It kind of spreads out from the middle. The helix has 2 components to it. This is the lower level south end staging yard, goes around the helix, and at this middle level, it comes out across a drop-down bridge to the Fresno area. And then when you continue through Fresno and around through back to Friant again, you once again get back in the helix, and that takes you up to the second deck here, up to Berrien Vista. So and this is the logging area that'll be on top of the helix. It's a space waster, but we made pretty good use of it, I think. And I saw the question about the height of the layout. I'll have to look that up. I don't remember exactly. And this again is the upper level north end staging. Both of them have a manual turntable, which is simply a piece of plywood with a bolt through the middle. And the electrical contact is these strips of copper that are copper flashing that you can get at Home Depot or something that has an adhesive on the back. You peel the paper off and it sticks down. And the copper flashing that is on the turntable bridge contacts these, and as you turn it around, it automatically aligns for the correct polarity for the adjacent track. And I've never liked handling locomotives too much. So after a train comes in from a run, it turns around, it gets turned on the turntable at the end, and I don't have to touch it. But I don't mind handling a caboose much per se. This is the Oriental Limited, what they call the hybrid, part brass, part cast locomotive. Runs wonderfully. These little track slider cars, once you get rid of the modern boxcar on top of it, they really do a nice job of cleaning things. And this, because this is the lower level of the layout, the staging yard is not visible. It's not part of the visible layout. So that's why we have these threaded rods that are used to support the outside of the upper deck above it. And this again is a cab forward I inherited from a friend who passed away. This is coming out of the staging yard up the 1% grade, the main line, the SP main line, so to speak, and the 3% grade down from Central Camp of up above. The 3% grade, I can just about get my, okay, this is the drop down bridge up above. Jumps across the gap and allows access to the staging yard. Two log landings on top of the helix with a little camp here. This is a Robert Parker photo from Central Camp, the machine shop. Prototype, my mock-up of the machine shop waiting to be replaced by the real model. This little guy is one of the transformers that was used at every location where there was a logging donkey, because they used all electric donkeys and logging equipment on this particular company. A little bitty mini diorama I did that shows the stages of constructing some of the loggers' cabins. And a fellow saw this photo at one point, and he said, "You know, those models should be weathered." Well, this one is being painted. This one has just been painted. They're both brand new. And I said, "How much weathering do you think you should see on a brand new building that's just been painted?" I didn't get any follow-up information from him. I can't imagine why. This continues around the end to Berrien Vista. And again, this is the granite area with the rock cuts and the rock slab faces. Once again, I want to point out that most of these buildings were built by Pam. She did the station, she did the passenger station here. I did the freight station. These two and this little station area will be appearing in Railroad Model Craftsman one of these years. Again, this is a kit bash to hide two of the upper deck supports in back. Berrien Solvents is the hazmat site that is named after Pam, obviously. She has several cars that are custom lettered for Berrien Solvents, and it represents a company with all kinds of crap floating around up there. This is one of Pam's models, Grandma's Haunted House. heading out of Berrien Vista and into the helix down, which takes you down to the Friant area. Again, we use Lentz DCC. Friant basically has a siding for a number of cattle pens and so on. And this is the prototype sinker derrick that would a couple of times a year they would drain down the water and pick up the logs that were too heavy to float. Didn't have any, and this is the log dump rollway. It didn't have any blueprints, but it just kind of had to size everything based for scratch built models based on photos. Photographs I took in the early 90s when the mill was still there. It's now a number of auto dealerships and such in that area. This little 3-truck Pacific O'Shea is one of 3 models I have that were once owned by my uncle, a modeler who I inherited from him. I remember watching these models operating on his layout when I was a young teenager. So it's a real pleasure to have them on our layout. And this leads through the Fresno area, which will have no particular recognition to Fresno. It's just the name for the town. And this is the lower level track, the drop down bridge that provides access to the staging yard. Which goes into the south end staging. I've since replaced the nasty yellow, so to speak, warm white bulbs down there with some that are a little bit better for the photos I want to take. There's the other end of the staging yard with the turntable. And this is the, oh, that's,
does anyone have any questions for Jeff?
Yeah, Jeff, what was that just a frame or two ago, that women in railroading T-shirt, or what was it?
well, it's a T-shirt that Pam made up. That is just a photo of some. It's based on a Steinheimer photo of some women from World War II working on some locomotives. And oh, how about that? Pam just happens to have one here. It's a picture of we did with the models of some model figures, scale figures working on a locomotive.
And who sells it?
We do. It's on our eBay shop.
Okay. I had some sisters who would look good in it.
Well, just to comment, I think the two layout tours today of Scott and Jeff showed what can be done on some very narrow benchwork. And I think the arm's reach idea is always good for everybody to do. That's what I've done on my layout. It works quite well.
Well, the narrow benchwork, I'm a real proponent of that. But having spent some time at some club layouts that grew like wedding cakes with things underneath there, it was a little more of a challenge. But then I'm kind of a big guy and I can't wrap myself up under a layout like some people can.
Yeah, enjoyed your presentation, everybody, especially the construction, how it's coming together. Very, very fascinating. Really good stuff. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you.
Here.
Hello again. This is another reminder that this virtual layout tour has been brought to you by members of the 4th Division of the Pacific Northwest region of the National Model Railroad Association. And we hope you've enjoyed it. And we want to encourage you to, again, find out about the NMRA online. Both PNR and NMRA have an excellent website where you can get information about joining and participating in this and other activities like our clinics that are held all over the region. So thank you for joining us today and wish you great modeling.